From Transport Topics in Washington, D.C., this is RoadSigns. Here is your host, Seth Clevenger.
Thank you for listening to RoadSigns, the podcast series from Transport Topics that explores the trends and technologies that are shaping the future of trucking. In this episode, we're going to take you inside the making of TT's 2024 Top 100 Private Carriers list, which we recently published on August 19th. To produce this list, we compiled data on the largest private fleet operators in North America to assemble an updated Top 100 ranking based on tractor count. The publication also includes information on each company's revenue, trailers, straight trucks, business units, and more. And in addition to the Top 100 list, we also published separate rankings of the largest private carriers operating in specific industries, such as food service, beverage, retail, and the energy sector. The updated rankings are now available online at ttnews.com, and if you haven't already done so, you can get exclusive access to the complete version of our Top 100 Private Carriers report by subscribing to Transport Topics at ttn.ws/ttsubscribe. And now, to discuss this year's Top 100 Private Carriers list and our biggest takeaways from the project, I'm going to bring in my colleague Mike Senatore, Features Coordinator at Transport Topics. Thanks for joining the conversation, Mike.
Thanks for having me on, Seth. Happy to join.
So to start here, I think it's always helpful to take our listeners through the process of producing our Top 100 and sector lists and helping them understanding the work that goes into this. So Mike, could you just take a moment here to describe how we gather the data for this project and how we use it to produce our updated private carrier rankings each year?
Sure. So the majority of our data that we use for the Top 100 list comes from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's Public Safety Measurement System database. That's a publicly available database that provides equipment counts for all carriers registered with the Department of Transportation. That includes tractor counts, trailers, straight trucks, anything of the sort. For other company information that we publish on the list, including revenues, company details, operating units, those come largely from annual reports, SEC filings, and generally using companies' websites and other online resources. We do send out a survey each year to a list of industry contacts that we have, but that we generally see a weaker volume of responses to that survey due to the size of the companies on the list. You know, these are largely billion-dollar companies on the Top 100 list, and so we definitely rely more on our own data gathering efforts.
Yeah, certainly compared to our Top 100 for-hire carriers list, right? You know, those are companies that are trucking companies first and foremost. That's what they do. Private carriers is a bit of a different stance, a bit of a different position where the fleet operation is sometimes viewed, of course, as a cost center. It's not the primary business. That does make it, traditionally a little bit tougher for us in the trade press to communicate at times with private fleets. But we still do get, of course, some involvement and some participation in our survey. Correspondence with, call it the head of supply chain or fleet operator, or fleet operations directors at some of these large private carriers as well. We'd love to have more, and of course, toward the end here, I think we'll offer up some advice and a bit of a call to action for how you can get involved if you see that your private fleet operation is not on our list and you think it would qualify either for the Top 100 or one of our sector lists. So it is very much a mixture of data that's available publicly. The FMCSA data is important, as well as our own work interacting, gathering data directly from these large private fleet operators.
Right.
So I should, of course, mention that we are always looking to expand. We're always looking to bring in more folks who are willing to share their information. In fact, since I'm mentioning it here at the top, maybe you could give a quick overview on that, Mike. How can companies get involved if they're interested in participating? What's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, so the best way to throw your hat into the ring, so to speak, is to reach out to us directly. You can contact our email inbox, tteditor@trucking.org, and express your interest. And that's really the best way to get your company on our radar and make sure that we have your up to date information and we can properly consider you for both our top 100 list and any of our sector lists that your company might be applicable to.
Yeah, well, now that we've explained how the rankings work and how we put it all together, let's go ahead and take a look at the new rankings that we've just published this year. This year, the biggest change is right at the very top. So, of course, many folks in the industry have been following Walmart and some of the latest initiatives to strengthen their in-house trucking operations. Well, it just so happened that the company's been expanding and also really ramped up their driver recruiting efforts, and as a result, the company is now up to number one on this year's Transport Topics Top 100 Private Carriers list. They were number two last year, so it's not a huge leap, but it's been a long time since we've had a change at number one in this publication, so it is pretty noteworthy. Walmart is up to 12,663 power units. That's up about 1,300 from a year ago. And that increase was enough for it to overtake longtime industry leader PepsiCo Inc. for the top spot. So, as I mentioned, Walmart isn't just adding new equipment, they're also investing in their drivers. In recent years, the company has boosted driver pay. They've established a training program for in store and warehouse employees to transition into professional driving jobs. So, that's a very interesting pipeline recruiting channel for them. And the first graduates of that driver training program actually hit the road last year, so they're starting to reap the benefits of that program. As I mentioned before, Walmart's ascent to number one marks the end of a long run. In fact, 14 years at the top by PepsiCo. So this is a pretty big change. It's the biggest change at the top of this list since I've been producing it at Transport Topics. But Mike, I'll turn to you. Your thoughts on Walmart becoming now the largest private carrier in North America.
Well, it was certainly a shock at first. As you know, PepsiCo has been at the top for such a long run, as you said, but after the initial kind of shock subsided, it really did start to make sense. I mean, as you said, Walmart has been expanding its private fleet for years now. The investments that it's made in its drivers with the pay raises, the training programs, increased benefits, and general general additions that have made truck driving jobs more attractive for potential employees. Like you've mentioned, additionally adding power units to its fleet. Walmart has really just used multiple channels to enhance its private fleet operations. And it's important that it's done so because it relies on and really prioritizes its in house fleet as the key to its supply chain as much as any other carrier in North America. So it doesn't come as a huge shock that Walmart made it to the top of this list.
Yeah, certainly noteworthy, and this did prompt me to do a little bit of research. Spent some time through our own archives at Transport Topics to gather some details on the history of this ranking, and this relatively recent history, right? TT published the top 100 private carriers list for the first time back in 2002. So it's not something we've done forever, but it's been a good 2+ decades now. And along the way, I did discover that Walmart was actually number one once before, and it was that first year in 2002. Walmart debuted as number one on our first ever top 100 private carriers list. Just a year after that, though, they dropped down to number three. That was driven by the sale of McLane Company to Berkshire Hathaway, and McLane, of course, is to this day a major food service distribution company. Used to be a Walmart subsidiary. Now they're separate. But in the years since then, McLane has remained one of the big players in the private fleet sector for sure. In fact, they're currently number 8 on our top 100. But Walmart has since now more than 2 decades later has regained that number one position. I, of course, mentioned PepsiCo, a 14-year run at number one starting back in 2010. But back before that, a couple other companies also had turns at number one. Food service distributor Cisco Corporation was number one for a while. Former beverage supplier, Coca-Cola Enterprises, was also the largest private carrier for a certain period of time. So we've seen some changes at the top. It's been a while, but in this case, it's actually a return to the beginning for our list, with Walmart getting back to number one more than 2 decades later. As we get into this list, I want to also remind our listeners that you can view the top 100 and sector lists online at ttnews.com. Also, you can get exclusive access to the complete version of our top 100 private carriers report by subscribing to Transport Topics if you're not subscribed already. And you can do so at ttn.ws/tt subscribe. Mike, just again going down the list here, what are some other companies or ranking changes that stand out to you, most prominently as you review the updated top 100?
Well, a lot of the companies that stood out to me were some of the ones that saw really huge growth in their private fleets on this year's list. Um, Builders First Source, a Texas based distributor of building materials, is really a prime example of this. It expanded its fleet by over 700 tractors in the past year, and that was the second largest addition of tractors on the list after Walmart. And because of that, the company moved up 22 spots on the list to number 22. And another example of that was the North American operations of Brenntag SE. That company also jumped up on this year's list with an additional 300 power units compared to last year, placing it at number 44. And the J.R. Simplot Company, a producer of agricultural products, nearly doubled the size of its tractor fleet, jumping 38 spots to number 48. But the largest margin of growth, though, it came from the Home Depot, which joined this year's list for the first time, actually. It added nearly 500 tractors and debuted at number 50. And this was due in part to acquisitions that it made in 2023, including Temco, which was an appliance delivery and installation firm that's since been rolled into Home Depot's in-house operations. So what really stood out to me from the list was these companies that saw really big expansions of their private fleet in the past year, and because of that, leaped up on the list.
Yeah, thanks for pointing those companies out. And of course, over time, you see some movement here and there. Mergers and acquisitions are usually a big source of shakeups, and we'll get into that a little bit more a bit later in this conversation. But uh, when we gather the data, our first choice and our best option is always to get the information straight from the source. When companies either reply to our survey or through correspondence will give us their most up to date equipment counts, which is what we use for this ranking.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of cases, of course, we're reliant on FMCSA data. What's filed on with what the companies have uh, submitted to FMCSA, and so there is a lag with that, right? So sometimes those aren't as fully up to date. So that's not our first preference, but and also, as we know, that sometimes companies through acquisitions and there are multiple DOT numbers under the same fleet, same business.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a little messy, and it can be a challenge for us to assemble all that data. So that's one of the caveats of dealing with some of the imperfect data out there. We do our best to assemble it and put it all together, but there are some challenges involved in that. I did want to spend some time, apart from the list itself, talking about business conditions out there for private carriers. This report is always more than a list. We're also looking at what these companies are dealing with, what's happening in the market, what are the big issues and trends. It's really sort of almost like a mini almanac, or you can almost think of it as a yearbook for the private fleet sector. Um, and really, for the past few years now, shippers have had the negotiating power, in the freight market. They've benefited from an overabundance of for-hire truck capacity. That's been holding down freight rates. So if you're a shipper, for the last few years, you've been able to find a truck, probably at a a pretty reasonable price or lower price than you have in the past. Uh, but what's interesting, at least for these companies that are at the very top, these are top 100 level private fleets, rather than taking full advantage of the market conditions, we continue to see many of these large shippers ramp up investments in their own private fleets. And usually, when you talk to them, the rationale is they want to enhance customer service. They want to gain more control over their supply chains. I think a lot of that is still driven by the experiences of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. So a lot of these large shippers want to control their own destinies a little bit more. And going back to Walmart, I think they're actually a great example of this. They are still very, very dependent on for-hire carriers, of course. They have so much freight that they move and need to move, but they're also growing their private fleet, even at a time when the trucking market and the freight market favors them as a shipper. As you go through the list, we found that more than half of this year's top 100 private carriers grew their tractor fleets during the past year. So it's not just Walmart, but we see in general, at least among these large shippers, continued expansion in their private fleets. Mike, I want to turn to you on this as well. What are your thoughts on this continued growth for private trucking fleets? Again, at least among these large private carriers that are at the level of the top 100 list.
Well, with the economic uncertainty that's been prevalent in recent years, including the recession fears and the interest rate hikes, as you mentioned, the weakness of for hire freight rates and the extra capacity, when we started piecing together the list, I was really expecting to see some downsizing and maybe selling off of assets. But in most cases, or in many cases, the opposite has really been true. The key factor that you mentioned is the desire of these shippers to have say over their own supply chains. Um, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruptions that it caused to the supply chain, a lot of businesses saw how reliant they were on the freight market and how quickly things can go south when those conditions begin to deteriorate. So, lots of shippers have turned to in house transportation to reduce that reliance on the for hire market. Many have implemented a sort of hybrid model where their own power units handle local transportation of products to different facilities, while for hire trucking firms handle final mile or similar models to that. So it really goes to show that companies are increasingly looking to improve their autonomy in a way by becoming less reliant on the freight market, which has proven to be somewhat unpredictable and pretty susceptible to major shifts.
Yeah, I think that's the overall trend, and especially those shippers that were heavily reliant on spot market
Mhm.
freight. Really struggled during that post-pandemic surge, where there was at that time it was just so difficult to find a truck. Rates really just skyrocketed. At that time, I think that there were some lessons learned among some
Right.
shippers, and one clear example of that, of course, is investing in your private fleet. If you have a private trucking division, strengthening it, maybe expanding it. Also, I think a lot of focus, a lot of interest in dedicated as a way to for companies to insulate themselves against that, and also just contract freight rates. Just shifting. If you're reliant on for hire, then shifting more toward contract rather than spot market where possible is another example of ways to add some, to make your supply chain a bit more reliable, a bit more predictable in an unpredictable world. So I think that I had a similar expectation. I thought that we'd see a lot of shippers really try to take advantage of current freight market conditions, and I'm sure that is true for many, but at least among these very large shippers that do have large private fleets, we've seen them actually lean into that,
Mhm.
which has been interesting to see. I mentioned that, of course, mergers and acquisitions are always one of the more interesting things to watch on this list. That's true yet again. So I'm going to go through a few of the major ones here. Next tier oilfield solutions, it's a major private fleet that's in the energy sector. They merged with Patterson UTI Energy last September. created a very large drilling and well completion service provider. That combined company is now number 16 on our top 100 when you add together the private fleet operations. And Mike, you mentioned Home Depot. They're on the list at number 50 this year. And one of the big reasons for that was their June acquisition of SRS Distribution. They're a distributor of roofing materials and building supplies. SRS actually, as an independent company, ranked number 89 on last year's top 100 list prior to the acquisition. So that moved Home Depot up the list. And of course, the one that we've been watching, it feels like for years now, with no resolution in the grocery sector, is Kroger and Albertsons. Now the Federal Trade Commission is trying to block that acquisition. Kroger has been seeking to acquire Albertsons companies for a while now. That was a proposed merger that was first announced back in October of 2022. But we're still waiting to see if that deal will ultimately move forward. It's run into a lot of challenges. It's working its way through the court system now, but we're watching it closely. For now, these are two independent companies. If that does go through, that would combine the number 26 and number 42 ranked private fleets on our list. So that would be certainly a big one. A lot of ramifications, not just for the grocery world, but also for private fleets. Mike, what are some M&A examples or activity that stand out to you the most when you look at the updated top 100 list?
Well, the merger of Patterson UTI and Nextier is certainly the highest profile on the top 100. The combined company does retain the Patterson UTI Energy name, but most of its fleet remains operated by Nextier. And we expect the company will remain one of the leaders in the drilling and completion market going forward. And as you said, we've been talking about Home Depot and the acquisitions that it made in 2023. And the addition of SRS Distribution is the single largest factor in Home Depot joining this year's list. SRS, particularly Roofline, which is a distributor of roofing products and other building materials on the West Coast, accounts for a significant chunk of Home Depot's private fleet. And yes, of course, we're all still keeping our eyes on the proposed deal between Kroger and Albertsons. As you said, it's been held up due to antitrust concerns and a number of other legal roadblocks, but that's definitely something that we're going to continue watching. If it does come to pass, it would propel them up the top 100 list. And of course, it would have potentially massive ripple effects on the grocery market in the U.S.
For sure. Another point of interest, I think, every year is the companies that are new to the list. That either join the list or appear for the first time. Sometimes that's companies that expand and they grow their fleet to a point where it qualifies. And there are also examples where maybe a company that's a little bit off of our radar, we discover them or they discover us and we add them to the list if we find that they qualify. There are so many different private fleets out there that are right at the cusp of being a top 100 level, and sometimes it's a matter of us discovering them or finding out that they have grown to the point where they qualify for the list. So one of the prominent newcomers this year is Dollar General. They make their debut actually all the way up at number 18. So the company's been pretty public about their efforts to expand their private fleet up to more than 2,000 tractors now. And really the primary goal there is to optimize costs and, again, gain more control over their supply chain. It's a very common refrain from some of these large shippers. Another newcomer or a company that rejoins the list this year is Nutrien. It's a Canada-based fertilizer and agricultural services company. We didn't have new data for a while, but we have it this year, and we have them on the list at number 10. They are a very large private fleet operator. Another one that's new is Select Water Solutions. They're a Houston-based provider of water management services to the oil and gas industry. They're on the list at number 38. And quite a few newcomers, actually, the top 100 this year, especially as you get a little bit further down the list. regional soft drink distributor. Coca-Cola Southwest Beverages is at number 55. You'll find quite a few beverage distributors across the top 100 bottling companies. That is a major piece of the private fleet segment. Also, Quick Trip, Midwestern convenience store operator, is at number 73 this year. Industrial gases firm Matheson Trigas is at number 81. Cheney Brothers is a Florida-based food service distributor, is at number 83. And H&E Equipment Services at number 94. A couple other newcomers, UFP Industries, they're a provider of building materials and packaging services, is at number 97. And auto part retailer AutoZone is at number 99. So again, a lot of companies that have either are new to the list or rejoined the list. More so than usual. There are years where only a handful. We actually had quite a few this year. But Mike, what's your take on the newcomers to this year's list?
Well, you touched on it there, but for the top 100 private carriers list, the nature of newcomers to the top 100 is a little bit unique. They could really fall into one of two categories. They could be either companies that expanded their fleet enough to now qualify for the list, or a company that we've just now gained real visibility into or more reliable data regarding. Nutrien is a good example of a company that was previously on the top 100 list, but dropped off of the list due to a lack of reliable and up-to-date information or equipment counts. But with that information this year, they were able to rejoin the list and immediately re-enter the top 10. And on the other hand of that is Select Water Solutions, joining the list at number 38 this year. That company is the result of a shifting in focus and a rebrand of Select Energy Services, which had previously been a mainstay on the petroleum and chemical sector list in previous editions. But the company has now focused its operations on sustainable water, products and infrastructure, and chemical manufacturing. And part of that shift included an expansion of its private fleet, which added over 900 tractors since it last reported data to FMCSA.
Yeah, for sure. Those are all. It's interesting to see again these changes, and you especially see it actually over time. If you flip a few years back, 5, 10 years or so, and I noticed this going through our archives. Just mostly to check our past number one companies on this list over the years, and there are a lot of familiar names, of course, on the list, but also some have changed quite a bit, and you really start to see that over time. We've covered a lot of ground here, but I also wanted to briefly touch on our updated sector rankings. Right, these are the separate lists from the top 100. They rank the largest private fleets operating in various industries, like food service, beverage, retail. So it's more of a ranking of like companies, that operate in the same industry. Mike, which industry sector list did you find to be the most interesting this year, and what stood out about it?
Well, there were a couple things that stood out to me from the sector lists. Many of the additions that we saw to the top 100 list also shook up the corresponding sector lists. Nutrien rejoined the agriculture and food processing list at number 2. Dollar General, as we mentioned, debuted at number 3 on the wholesale and retail list, and Select Water Solutions jumped up to number 7 on the petroleum and chemical list. It had previously been number 22 last year. And two of the other big stories that we've talked about thus far, the expansion of Builders First Sources fleet and Home Depot's acquisition of SRS Distribution, those both had large impacts on the building materials sector list. Uh, Builders for the Builders First Source, for example, jumped up to number 2 in that sector list after placing number 5 last year, while SRS Distribution's fleet joining Home Depot's placed their combined operations at number 6. But in terms of one list that really jumped out to me was the manufacturing sector list, because it largely bucked the trend that we've seen across the other sector lists of companies expanding their fleets, whereas with the manufacturing list, we did see some downsizing, including all 3 of the companies at the top of that sector list. Looking at the list as a whole, the total tractor count was down 7% compared to last year, which was the largest drop of any of the sector lists that we put together this year.
Yeah, that is interesting, and the story is not the same across all industries for sure. And
Mm-hmm.
for folks who really want to dive into it, it is available online. You can take a look and see how these companies rank. And more up to date information on whatever industry you might be operating in. Mike, thank you once again for your hard work on this top 100 private carriers report. This is always one of our biggest projects of the year. And also, thank you for taking our listeners inside the making of this year's report. Appreciate you taking the time for this conversation.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
We hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look at Transport Topics' 2024 Top 100 Private Carriers list. As a reminder, you can view the full Top 100 and sector lists online at ttnews.com. And of course, if you're a Transport Topics subscriber, you already have a hard copy packaged with an August 19th issue of TT. If you've enjoyed this episode of Road Signs, please let others know. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If my questions have sparked questions of your own, share them with me and the Road Signs team. You can email us at share@ttnews.com. And of course, we'll be back soon with a fresh episode of Road Signs. Until then, I'm Seth Clevenger. Thank you for listening.